ora pro nobis. You know, in the early centuries of the Christian movement, there was no feminine divine, even though that has been part of our human history for as long as we have been human. But finally, later on in the Middle Ages, it became impossible to deny how important that was, and the cult and the worship of Mary, and the prayers to Mary to intercede, because somehow Mary in her life experience knew something about us as human beings that couldn't be found elsewhere. Thank you very much. That was so beautiful. The reading I'd like to share with you this morning comes from Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, the most famous person you may never have heard of. I'll tell you more about her in a moment, but this is a poem entitled Songs for the People, a poem she wrote in the later half part of the 19th century. She says, "Let me make the songs for the people, songs for the old and young, songs to stir like a battle cry wherever they are sung. Not for the clashing of sabers, for carnage, nor for strife, but songs to thrill the hearts of men with more abundant life. Let me make the songs for the weary, amid life's fever and fret, till hearts shall relax their tension and careworn brows forget. Let me sing for little children before their footsteps stray, sweet anthems of love and duty to float on life's highway. I would sing for the poor and aged when shadows dim their sight of the bright and restful mansions where there shall be no night. Our world, so worn and weary, needs music pure and strong, to hush the jangle and discords of sorrow, pain, and wrong. Music to soothe all its sorrow till war and crime shall cease, and the hearts of men grow tender girdle the world with peace." Frances Ellen Watkins Harper was born in 1823 in Baltimore, Maryland, just a handful of years after William Ellery Channing declared the existence of Unitarianism in his famous Baltimore sermon at the First Unitarian Church of Baltimore, which to this day has slave galleries around the top. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper was born to parents who were both free blacks in Baltimore. But she was orphaned at the age of 3. Her aunt and uncle, Henrietta and William Watkins, took her in and raised her. William Watkins was a well-known and outspoken abolitionist. He established a literary society for Black people, and he established a school for Black students. It was called, I'm going to call it by the right name, the Watkins Academy for Negro Youth in 1820. Frances attended the academy. This was not limited to education for young boys. Frances attended the academy until the age of 13, when most of the students were expected to leave and begin to work. And she did. She took a job as a seamstress and nursemaid for a family that owned, a white family that owned a bookstore. But that was just the beginning. By the age of 21, she had published her first book of poems and started to gain notoriety throughout what was then the United States. Now, maybe some of you remember some time back I shared with you the story of William Still, the African-American man who was a clerk in the Philadelphia Abolitionist Society and who noted all of the details of every person who came through the Underground Railroad, so that someday, if William Still could facilitate a reunion with family members, and this happened for many, many of those who came. Well, William Still was a friend of Henry Watkins, and Francis Allen reached out to him when Maryland passed a law saying that at that time, any free Black person could be rounded up and sold into slavery. And so she felt she couldn't stay in her, in her home state. She had traveled some and worked as a teacher after being a nursemaid and so on. So she reached out to William Still, who invited her to Philadelphia. And she came and lived with him and his wife. At that time, she made both a commitment, a firm commitment to the cause of abolition, but also a firm commitment to women's suffrage. She also joined the First Unitarian Church of Philadelphia. It resonated with her values, and perhaps as you listen to the poem, you heard the Unitarian Universalist values of peace over war, of being together versus being torn apart by whatever is happening in the world. As time went on, her articles became famous. She published her second book of poetry. The poem I read is from that second book. And she started lecturing and traveling around the country. She married fairly late in life, had 2 children. Her husband died after only 4 years, and she continued her life of lecturing and speaking and her deep involvement in her church. When John Brown was about to be executed for the action at Harper's Ferry, she wrote him a letter celebrating his desire for freedom for everybody, and wishing him well in this ordeal. She was, without a doubt, the most famous Black woman in the United States in the 19th century. But she's not in the history books. She's not in our Unitarian Universalist history books, or at least she wasn't until about 10 years ago, when one of my friends and colleagues, who's also a historian besides being a minister, researched her and found her history at First Unitarian and brought a group of us, about 100 plus of us together to celebrate and to visit her grave. And now she's become a hero to many of us, including me. She's known as the mother of Black journalism. And she did all of this grounded in our faith. And I'm sure you can only imagine what she went through in order to do that. So it was in the fall of 1861, moving on, when Ebenezer Fisher, the president of the Theological School of St. Lawrence University, heard a forceful knock on his door, and he went to open it and saw a small, soft-spoken young woman who introduced herself as Olivia Brown and thanked him for having accepted her to his theological school. He was confused. He had kind of half-heartedly said, well, yeah, maybe you can come, but really, he said, I don't believe women are suited to ministry. And so he figured that would discourage her enough not to come, and it did not. So there she was. Not only did she graduate from St. Lawrence Theological School, in spite of the fact that her classmates in seminary, well, of course, were all men, made fun of her. They made fun of her for her voice. They would gather under her window and pretend to be reciting her sermons. They told her her sermons were consistently subpar. I mean, she got hazed, basically. 19th century equivalent of sorority or fraternity hazing in seminary, of all places. But she was not discouraged. She was not discouraged by the president of the seminary. She was not discouraged by the actions. And she not only graduated, but she persuaded the northern sort of powers that be in the Universalist denomination to ordain her with full rights and privileges. A very persuasive woman, Olympia Brown. And they did. And she went off and began, I guess, kind of a dual career, because she was a minister and she served a parish in Massachusetts and parishes and congregations in other places. But she was also, from the beginning, a co-worker with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony in the fight for suffrage. When the 19th Amendment was finally passed in the late 1920s, Olympia Brown was one of the oldest pioneers in the fight who was actually able to vote. She had begun her work for suffrage more than 50 years before it passed and she had the chance to vote. So when she says, as she said in the beginning piece that I read, basically, don't look for immediate gratification in your social justice rights. She knew what she was talking about. So Olympia Brown sets an example for me, but she sets an example not only of believing that those of us who identify as women may have a contribution to make in a religious community, but that our faith is about more than serving from the pulpit. It is also serving in the world. As you said, I think both of you, David and Marie, you said, doing something in the world, living a good life and fighting for the freedom that is at the core of the faith we hold. I read a booklet that was basically the petition to the United States Senate to allow Olympia Brown, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and a couple of others to come to a Senate hearing in order to share their arguments for giving the vote to women. And so they each kind of wrote a little paragraph about what they believed, really good arguments. They should have all been lawyers. The Senate declined to hold the hearing, but said, if you want to come and tell us in private, you can do that. This was 1863. Clearly, they did nothing about it. So let me, if you'll allow me, just repeat some of Olympia Brown's words. There's nothing in the world so important as to be loyal to this faith which has placed before us the loftiest ideals, which has comforted us in sorrow, strengthened us for noble duty, and made the world beautiful. Do not demand immediate results, but rejoice that we are worthy to be entrusted with this great message. I'm going to turn to another, this time it's a group of women. They were known as the Iowa Sisterhood. There were, I believe, 21 of them. It's 2021. It's not a large group, but these were women who, between the years of 1880 and 1930, became Unitarian and Universalist ministers. There were still very, very few ministers, period, in the United States. Both of those groups, by the way, both of the U's were more hospitable to women than other denominations, but still, there were still very few of us. And they had the courage to follow their ministerial call and come to places that none of their male colleagues wanted to take. So these were churches in the Great Plains. These were not considered, great places to go be a minister. Most of them were small. Actually, the sisterhood founded most of these churches. But they came. And they came to churches throughout the Great Plains. They supported one another. And while much that is written about them says, they didn't really change anything for women. They really, it didn't make it easier for women to become ministers, but what they did was kind of cool. I'm going to respectfully disagree. I'm going to say they made their mark. They made their mark on our faith. And today, our faith tradition has a majority of ministers who are women. At an unguarded moment, you can ask me if we get the good pulpits and that kind of stuff, but I'm not going to talk about that now. Women like Olympia Brown had blazed the path, and these women came in and did the work. The Reverend Eliza Tucker Wilkes, as I told you earlier, founded 11 new Unitarian and Universalist congregations. She was a circuit-riding preacher who had been raised a Baptist and was ready to become a Baptist minister when she said, "I'm leaving the devil behind. I'm going to become a Universalist." We mean it when we say we're going to love the hell out of this world. Often on a Sunday, she would preach in one church in the morning, and then she would ride hours to preach at a 7th church in the afternoon, and she raised 6 children while she was doing it. Reverend Ada C. Bowles was a preacher and women's rights activist. She wrote a small piece called Liberty's Daughters. Rise up, O woman, she says, no longer sit at ease, the banner of thy freedom is lifting in the breeze. Be ready for the morning that breaks thy long, dark night, up ignorance and bondage, and hail the coming right. Maybe it's not a coincidence that every single one of these women of the Iowa Sisterhood spent all of the time they didn't spend ministering. They spent all of that time speaking, doing lectures, organizing, and fighting for women's rights and women's suffrage. Every single one of them. What they brought to our faith and what they brought to congregational life was a largely different perspective than their colleagues in Boston, who, by the way, despised them. They thought they were an embarrassment, that women ministers were embarrassment. Why? A, because they were outspoken activists for suffrage, but also because they understood that a faith community is also about our day-to-day lives. It's not an opportunity necessarily to just hear a very literary or academic sermon, although I love those, but it's an opportunity to deal with the real things in life. These churches had support groups for families and for mothers, had institutionalized things like helping one another, helping families, helping other families in the congregation with meals and all the things that are about pastoral care. Their messages were messages that didn't just come from their minds, they also came from their hearts and the fierceness of their call. And for that, and I'm not making this up, this is what, the powers that be. Mind you, didn't want those churches, but they didn't want those messages either, and every single one of them was essentially forced into retirement by 1930. Even though that chapter ended, I think they gave something really important to our faith. Tell you a little bit about one more, and then I know we have, oh geez, I won't, because I've been going over already. I'm so sorry. Our flower communion, I hope not only will celebrate this morning all of the many experiences of motherhood that we have, for those who are here and those who are not here this morning, but celebrate the beauty that is when we bring all of our different blooms to be together in one place. So I'm going to invite us to transition to that. I'm sure you know that the flower communion was begun by Father Norbert Chapek, a Unitarian minister in Czechoslovakia, who was eventually executed by the Nazis. But he had that same idea, and he taught his congregation to bring flowers and to take flowers and to see the flowers together as a symbol of who we are when we are together. So Dwight, I don't know if you're willing to play some flower communion music, but I invite you to come forward, enjoy the flowers, and please take some to enjoy yourself and perhaps enjoy with someone who you're celebrating with.